The cleaner arrived to clean the millionaire's mansion and was stunned to see her photo in a black frame. Taylor woke up to the soft hum of sunlight spilling through the cracks in her window. The old, familiar creak of the floorboards groaned beneath her feet as she moved toward the tiny kitchen of their modest home. The house was quiet, save for the faint sound of her mother, Linda, coughing lightly in the bedroom. It was a sound Taylor had grown accustomed to, though it still tugged at her heart every time. Her routine was simple but relentless. Taylor had been working as a cleaner for years, taking whatever job she could find to pay for her mother's medication and keep their household afloat. Today was no different, or so she thought. Linda emerged from the bedroom wrapped in her faded floral robe. "Morning, sweetheart," she said, her voice tired but warm. "Don't forget your lunch." Taylor smiled, grabbing the small brown paper bag from the counter. "I won't." "Are you sure you're okay, Mom? I can stay if you're not feeling well." Linda waved her hand dismissively. "Don't worry about me. You've got work to do. Besides, something tells me today's going to be special." Taylor chuckled softly. Her mom always had a way of making the ordinary seem hopeful, even magical. It was one of the many things Taylor admired about her. The day started like any other, with Taylor pulling into town in her aging truck. The tires crunched on the gravel driveway of her first client's home. She spent hours scrubbing floors and wiping windows, her hands moving on autopilot as her mind wandered to how she'd stretch this week's pay to cover bills and groceries. Around noon, Taylor received a call from her boss. "Hey, Taylor, I've got a last-minute request. Big place, short notice, pays double. You up for it?" Taylor hesitated. Double pay was tempting, but the thought of adding more to her already long day was exhausting. Still, she couldn't afford to say no. "Sure," she said, trying to muster enthusiasm. "Where's the job?" Her boss gave her the address. "It's the old Turner Mansion. You know the one. Big, fancy place on the edge of town. The new owner wants it cleaned top to bottom. They're moving in tomorrow." The Turner Mansion. Taylor had heard stories about the place growing up. It was rumored to be haunted, though she didn't believe in such things. Still, the idea of stepping inside that grand estate sent a shiver down her spine. By mid-afternoon, Taylor found herself standing at the wrought iron gates of the mansion. The sprawling estate loomed before her, its grandeur intimidating and strangely out of place in their small town. She parked her truck and walked up the long driveway, her boots crunching on the gravel. Inside, the house was everything she imagined, and more. High ceilings, intricate chandeliers, and polished marble floors gave the place an air of untouchable wealth, but it was also eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy. Almost watchful, she got to work immediately, starting with the foyer and making her way through the various rooms. Each space seemed to have its own personality. The regal dining room with its ornate table, the cozy parlor with a fireplace that hadn't been lit in years, and the grand library, which quickly became her favorite. The library was unlike anything she'd ever seen. Shelves of books stretched from floor to ceiling, their spines a rainbow of leather-bound titles. A large wooden desk sat in the center, and behind it, a wall displayed an assortment of framed photographs and paintings. Taylor's eyes landed on one photo in particular, and her breath caught in her throat. It was an old picture, slightly faded, but unmistakable. There, smiling back at her, was her mother, Linda, holding a baby. Taylor instantly recognized the scene. It was her, as a baby, in her mother's arms. Her heart pounded as she stepped closer. This wasn't possible. That photo had always been kept in a box under her mother's bed. She'd seen it countless times growing up. How could it be here, in this mansion? Among strangers, she heard a sound behind her and spun around. A man stood in the doorway watching her. He was tall, with salt and pepper hair and an air of authority. His tailored suit and piercing eyes made it clear he wasn't just anyone. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone polite but guarded. Taylor couldn't find her voice. She gestured to the photo on the wall, her hand trembling. That's my mother." The man's expression shifted, his eyes narrowing slightly as he stepped into the room. He studied her for a long moment before glancing at the photo. "Your mother?" he repeated, his voice softer now, almost disbelieving. "Yes," Taylor said, her voice barely above a whisper. "How do you know her?" The man hesitated, his jaw tightening. "We need to talk." Taylor's heart raced. as the man's words hung in the air. "We need to talk." His voice, steady and low, carried a weight she couldn't quite place. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. "Why is there a picture of my mother in your house?" she asked, her voice a mixture of confusion and defiance. The man sighed, his eyes clouding with a mix of emotions. "It's a long story, one I'm not sure you're ready to hear." Taylor straightened her shoulders, the fight in her rising to the surface. "Try me." He gave a small, bitter smile, then nodded toward the plush chairs in the corner of the library. "Please, sit." She hesitated. Everything in her told her to run, to escape this surreal situation. But curiosity, and something deeper, something she couldn't name, rooted her to the spot. She crossed the room and sank into the chair, the leather cool beneath her fingers. The man took the seat opposite her. "I'm Mark," he said, his voice softer now. "Mark Bennett." The name didn't ring any bells, but it didn't need to. His eyes, dark and intense, held a familiarity she couldn't shake, like staring into a mirror and seeing someone else's reflection. "Okay, Mark," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Explain." He leaned back, his gaze drifting to the photo on the wall. "I knew your mother a long time ago. We were close. Very close." He paused, his jaw tightening. "But things happened. People got in the way, and we lost each other." Taylor's fingers dug into the armrest. "People got in the way. What does that even mean?" "It means," he said, his voice laced with regret, "that we were separated by lies. Lies I didn't know about until it was too late." Her mind swirled with questions. This man, this stranger, was telling her he had a past with her mother, a past filled with secrets and heartbreak. And yet, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of connection. "Why didn't she ever tell me about you?" she whispered. Mark's face softened. "Maybe she was protecting you. Or maybe she didn't think I was worth mentioning." The pain in his voice was genuine, and it chipped away at her defenses. But she needed more than just words. "Why do you have this picture?" she asked, pointing to the photo. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, they were just two people caught in the same storm. "I've been looking for her, for years. This photo is all I have left of that time." Taylor's breath caught. He'd been searching for her mother. The thought stirred something deep inside her, a mixture of sadness and a strange, cautious hope. "But why now?" she asked. "Why did I have to be the one to find this?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Sometimes fate has a way of forcing our paths to cross. Maybe it's time for the truth to come out." The truth. She wasn't sure she was ready for it, but she couldn't ignore it either. There was a hole in her life, a missing piece she hadn't known existed until this moment. And now, standing on the edge of that revelation, she felt both terrified and drawn to it. She stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "I need to talk to my mom." Mark's face tightened, but he nodded. "Of course, but please, come back. There's more you need to know." Taylor's legs felt like lead as she walked out of the library, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. She barely registered the grand hallways, the marble floors, the intricate paintings. The house, once just a job, now felt like a maze of unanswered questions. The drive home was a blur. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, but she barely noticed. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. When she finally pulled into the driveway, the familiar sight of their small, worn house grounded her, if only for a moment. Inside, Linda was in the kitchen stirring a pot of soup. The smell of garlic and herbs filled the air, a comforting contrast to the chaos in Taylor's mind. "Mom," Taylor said, her voice shaking. Linda turned, her smile fading as she saw her daughter's face. "What happened?" Taylor held out her phone, the screen showing a photo she'd snapped of the picture in Mark's library. Why is this in his house? Who is Mark Bennett? Linda's face went pale, the spoon clattering onto the counter. Her hands trembled, and for a moment she couldn't speak. "Mom," Taylor's voice cracked. Linda took a shaky breath, tears welling in her eyes. "I hoped you'd never have to know. I thought I buried that part of my life forever." Taylor's world tilted. "He said he knew you, that you were in love." Linda nodded slowly, tears slipping down her cheeks. "We were, but it wasn't that simple." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I was trying to protect you." Linda whispered. From him, from the pain, from the people who tore us apart. Taylor's mind reeled. The secrets she'd grown up with were unraveling, and she wasn't sure she could handle what was left. But she knew one thing. She couldn't stop now. She needed answers, no matter how painful they might be. The air in the kitchen felt dense, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on both of them. Taylor stared at her mother, her mind spinning with questions she couldn't even form yet. The steam from the forgotten pot of soup curled into the air, filling the silence with a bitter contrast to the warmth it should have brought. "Sit down, honey," Linda finally whispered, her voice trembling. "You deserve to know the truth." Taylor sank into the worn kitchen chair, her fingers tracing the chipped wood on the table. Her heart pounded in her chest, a chaotic rhythm of fear and anticipation. Linda took a seat across from her, eyes red and brimming with tears she refused to let fall. "It started 20 years ago," Linda began, her voice distant, as if she were peeling back the layers of her memory. "I was young, just about your age, working at the Bennett estate as a maid. That's where I met Mark." She paused, a sad smile flickering across her face. He wasn't like the others. Despite his family's wealth, Mark was kind. He listened, cared. We fell in love so easily. It felt right. Taylor's throat tightened. The idea of her mother in love, young and full of hope, clashed with the reality she knew. A reality filled with hardship, sacrifice, and loneliness. "We planned to run away together," Linda continued, her voice breaking slightly. "But his family, his brother Stephen, found out. They didn't want Mark throwing away the family legacy for someone like me. Stephen threatened me, told me if I didn't leave, he'd make sure both of us suffered." Taylor's hands curled into fists. The thought of anyone threatening her mother ignited a slow, simmering rage deep inside her. "So you left?" Taylor's voice was barely a whisper. Linda nodded, tears finally slipping down her cheeks. "I thought I was protecting Mark. And you, I found out I was pregnant just days before I left. I wanted to tell him, but Stephen made sure I couldn't. He watched me, made sure I disappeared without a trace." The kitchen swam in Taylor's vision. The life she thought she knew felt like a lie, a story rewritten by someone else's cruelty. "Why didn't you tell me any of this?" Taylor asked, her voice trembling with emotion. "I thought I was doing the right thing," Linda said softly. "I didn't want you to grow up with that kind of darkness. I thought if we could just move on, we'd be okay, but I was wrong." Taylor wiped at her eyes, frustration and hurt swirling together. "Mark said he's been looking for you, for us." Linda looked down at her hands. "I didn't know. I thought he'd forgotten me, that he'd moved on, like his family wanted." Taylor's heart ached. How many years had been wasted on misunderstandings, on secrets meant to protect? But that only caused more harm. She felt a sudden, fierce determination rise in her chest. "This isn't over," she said firmly, meeting her mother's eyes. "He deserves to know, and so do I." Linda's eyes widened, a mixture of fear and hope shining through. "Are you sure, Taylor? This won't be easy. Digging up the past. It could hurt us more than help." Taylor shook her head. "We've lived in the dark long enough. I'm not going to let Stephen or anyone else keep us from the truth." Linda nodded slowly, reaching out to squeeze Taylor's hand. "Whatever you decide, I'll be with you." A sense of resolve settled over Taylor. The pieces of her life, though shattered, were finally beginning to make sense, and she was ready to pick them up, no matter how sharp the edges. The next morning, Taylor stood in front of the mansion once again. The sun was barely up, casting a golden glow over the estate. The wrought iron gates, once so imposing, now felt like the threshold to a truth she couldn't avoid. She took a deep breath and walked up the long driveway, each step firm and deliberate. The door opened before she could knock, and Mark stood there, his expression a mixture of hope and apprehension. "You came back?" he said softly. Taylor nodded. "We need to talk, all of us." Mark stepped aside, and Taylor entered the grand hallway. The air was cool, the silence stretching out between them. She glanced at the walls, at the portraits of ancestors who had no idea their legacy had been built on lies and betrayal. "I told my mom," Taylor said, breaking the silence. She confirmed everything. Mark's eyes darkened, his jaw clenching. "I knew Stephen had something to do with it, but I didn't realize the extent of his cruelty. Neither did we." Taylor replied. "But we're not going to let him win." Mark's gaze softened. "You have her strength, you know. Your mother's." Taylor felt a small flicker of pride. It was true. Her mother's resilience, her quiet courage, had been her guiding light. Now, it was her turn to carry that torch. "Where is he?" she asked. Mark hesitated. "Stephen's in town. He's been overseeing some of the family's business. He won't expect this." Taylor's fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. "Good. It's time he faces the truth." Mark nodded, his eyes glinting with determination. "Then let's face it together." For the first time, Taylor felt a sense of unity, of purpose. The tangled web of lies was finally beginning to unravel, and this time, she wasn't alone. Together, they stepped out of the mansion, ready to confront the past and reclaim the truth. The drive to town was tense, the silence between Taylor and Mark filled with unspoken thoughts. The hum of the engine was the only sound as they navigated the winding roads, the early morning sun casting long shadows over the landscape. Taylor's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles pale against the worn leather. Her mind buzzed with questions, scenarios playing out like a film reel she couldn't pause. Mark sat beside her, his jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the road ahead. Despite the years that had passed, the pain of betrayal and lost time etched itself deeply into his features. His presence was steady, though, a quiet strength that seemed to reach out to her like a lifeline when they pulled into town. The familiar sights of Main Street greeted them. The old diner, the hardware store, the post office with its peeling paint. These were places Taylor had known her entire life. But today, they felt different, as though she were seeing them through a new lens. Everything was the same, yet everything had changed. "Where do you think he'll be?" Taylor asked, her voice low and steady. Mark glanced at her, his eyes softening. "Stephen always liked to hold court at the coffee shop on the corner. He likes people to see him, to know he's in control." Taylor nodded, the determination in her chest solidifying. "Then let's go." They parked just down the street from the coffee shop. Through the large glass windows, she could see the morning crowd gathered inside, sipping their drinks, chatting and reading newspapers. In the far corner, a man sat alone, his posture arrogant, his eyes scanning the room like a predator surveying his territory. Stephen. Taylor felt her stomach tighten, or felt her stomach. A surge of adrenaline rushing through her veins. He looked so ordinary, dressed in a crisp suit, his hair neatly combed back. But there was something in the cold calculation of his gaze that sent a chill down her spine. Mark touched her shoulder gently. "You don't have to do this if you're not ready." She met his eyes, her resolve firm. "I am ready. I need to do this. For Mom. For us." Together, they stepped out of the car and walked toward the coffee shop. The bell above the door jingled as they entered, the smell of roasted coffee beans and fresh pastries washing over them. The chatter died down slightly as people noticed Mark. His presence was commanding, and whispers followed in his wake. Stephen's eyes flicked up, and for a split second, surprise flashed across his face before it was replaced by a smirk. Well, Stephen drawled, leaning back in his chair. "If it isn't my dear brother, and who's this, the help?" Taylor's cheeks flushed with anger, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm Taylor, Linda's daughter." The smirk faltered for just a moment, his eyes narrowing as he processed her words. "Linda's daughter," he repeated, his tone dripping with disdain. "Why are you here?" Mark stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "We know what you did. Stephen, we know how you threatened Linda, how you tore us apart." Stephen's smile twisted into something darker. "Oh, come on, Mark. I did you a favor. You were about to ruin everything for some nobody." "She wasn't a nobody." Mark's voice rose, the hurt and anger bubbling to the surface. "She was everything to me, and you took her away." Stephen shrugged, his expression cold and dismissive. "You were weak. Love makes people stupid. I protected the family, and you know it." Taylor couldn't hold back any longer. "You destroyed lives for your own selfish reasons. You stole years we can't get back. You think that makes you strong." Stephen's eyes snapped to hers, his smile gone. "I don't owe you an explanation, little girl." "No, but you owe us the truth," she shot back. "And you're going to face it, whether you like it or not." A murmur swept through the coffee shop. People were listening now, their eyes wide with curiosity and disbelief. The facade Stephen had so carefully maintained was starting to crack. Mark took a deep breath, his voice steady. "You might have controlled the past, but you won't control the future. We're done with your lies, Taylor and I. We're taking back what you stole." Stephen's face twisted into a sneer. "And what exactly do you think you're going to do? Expose me, ruin me? You don't have the power?" Taylor smiled coldly. "You'd be surprised what the truth can do." At that moment, the door swung open, and Linda stepped in. Her face was pale but resolute, her eyes meeting Stephen's with a quiet defiance that spoke of years of suffering. Stephen's confidence faltered. "Linda," he said, his voice barely a whisper. She nodded slowly. "It's over, Stephen. You don't get to hurt us anymore." The room was silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. Stephen looked around, his eyes darting from face to face, realizing his power was slipping away. For the first time, he looked small, insignificant. Mark reached for Taylor's hand, his grip warm and reassuring. "We're together now," he said softly, "and nothing you can do will change that." Stephen stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Without another word, he pushed past them and stormed out, the door slamming behind him. The spell was broken, the monster exposed. Taylor exhaled, her shoulders sagging with relief. They had faced the darkness, and though the scars would remain, they were finally free. The coffee shop buzzed with a quiet murmur as Stephen's exit left a void in the air. The clink of mugs and whispered conversations felt far away to Taylor. Her hands trembled slightly, the adrenaline of the confrontation ebbing away, leaving behind a hollow exhaustion. Linda stepped forward, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and grief. "Taylor, are you okay?" Her voice was soft, but the concern in it was sharp. Taylor nodded, though her thoughts were spinning. "I think so. She stopped, searching for the right words. "I didn't expect it to feel like this, like nothing changed, but everything did." Mark's hand rested gently on her shoulder. "It's a lot to take in, I understand." She looked at him, and for the first time, she saw the weight he carried too. The years of searching, of regret, of wondering what might have been. It mirrored her own confusion and hurt. "Can we go somewhere quieter?" Linda asked, her voice trembling. "There's still so much we need to talk about." Mark nodded. "My place isn't far. We can have some privacy there," Taylor agreed, and the three of them left the coffee shop. The sun was higher now, its warmth doing little to chase away the chill that had settled in her bones. As they walked, people watched them, their eyes curious, but no one dared to ask questions. Small towns had a way of knowing when the story wasn't theirs to tell. They climbed into Mark's sleek black car, and Taylor sank into the leather seat, the scent of the interior, rich and clean, strangely comforting. The ride to the mansion was silent, each of them lost in their thoughts. When they arrived, Mark led them through the grand hallway and into a cozy sitting room. Despite the mansion's grandeur, this room felt lived in. A fireplace lined with family photos, a worn leather couch, and a small table with a half-read book on it. It was a glimpse into the man behind the wealth. "Please, sit," Mark said, gesturing to the couch. Taylor and Linda settled in, the warmth of the room a stark contrast to the cold knot in Taylor's stomach. Mark poured them glasses of water, his hand steady despite the tension in the air. Linda took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on the glass in her lap. "Mark, I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I thought I was doing the right thing by leaving. I thought I was protecting you and Taylor." Mark's jaw clenched, but his eyes were soft. "I don't blame you, Linda. I blame Stephen. He took everything from us." Taylor's chest tightened. The weight of lost time felt unbearable. "But why did he do it?" she asked. "Why go to such lengths to destroy your lives?" Mark sighed, his shoulders sagging. "Stephen always resented me. Our parents put a lot of pressure on us to keep the family name pristine. I was the older brother, the heir to everything. He felt like he lived in my shadow. When he found out about you and me, Linda, he saw it as the perfect opportunity to ruin my life. And he succeeded." Linda's voice cracked. "I didn't know how far he'd go. When he threatened me, I believed him. I thought if I stayed, he'd hurt you. I couldn't risk it." Mark's eyes glistened. "I wish you had told me. We could have fought him together." Taylor's heart ached for them both. The love they once shared had been torn apart, but the remnants of it were still there. Fragile but real. She wanted to be angry, to scream about the injustice of it all. But mostly, she just felt empty. "So what happens now?" she asked, her voice small. Mark looked at her, his expression uncertain. "That's up to you, Taylor. I want to be in your life, if you'll let me. I know I can't make up for the years we lost, but I want to try." Linda reached over and squeezed Taylor's hand. "It's your choice, sweetheart. Whatever you decide, I'll support you." Taylor's throat tightened. The idea of having a father, of letting Mark into her life, was overwhelming. But there was also a flicker of hope, a fragile ember that refused to be snuffed out. "I need time to think," she said finally, her voice shaking. "This is a lot." Mark nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here." They sat in silence, the weight of the moment settling over them. The past was a broken puzzle, its pieces jagged and scattered. But maybe, just maybe, they could start putting it back together. Linda stood, her movements slow and deliberate. "We should get home," she said gently. "You need rest, Taylor." Taylor nodded, feeling a weariness that went beyond her body. Mark walked them to the door, his presence steady and reassuring. "Thank you," Taylor whispered, looking up at him, "for telling me the truth." Mark's eyes softened. "You deserve to know. No more secrets." She gave him a small smile, then turned and followed her mother out the door. The sunlight was blinding as they stepped outside, the world seeming too bright for all the shadows they had uncovered. As they drove away, Taylor glanced back at the mansion. It stood tall and silent, a monument to both pain and possibility. Her journey wasn't over. In fact, it felt like it was just beginning, and she had no idea where it would lead. The drive back home felt like a journey through fog. The roads were familiar. Yet Taylor couldn't shake the feeling that she was moving through a world she no longer recognized. Linda sat beside her in the passenger seat, silent, her eyes focused on the horizon. The hum of the engine was a poor distraction from the whirlwind of thoughts in Taylor's mind. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened as she replayed the events of the morning. The confrontation with Stephen, Mark's revelations, the look of pain in her mother's eyes. It felt like the ground beneath her feet had been ripped away, and she was left floating, untethered. When they finally pulled into the driveway, the old house welcomed them with its creaks and sighs, as if it sensed the weight they carried. Taylor killed the engine, and the silence that followed was almost unbearable. Linda took a deep breath and turned to her. "Honey, are you okay?" Taylor stared out the windshield, her voice barely audible. "I don't know, Mom. I feel like everything I thought I knew about my life was just a story someone else wrote for us." Linda's eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry, Taylor. I thought I was protecting you. I thought if we just kept moving forward, we could leave it all behind." Taylor's chest tightened. "But we didn't leave it behind. It was always there, hiding in the shadows. And now it's out in the open and I don't know what to do with it." Linda's hand reached out, resting gently on Taylor's shoulder. "You don't have to figure it all out right now. It's okay to take time, to feel everything you're feeling." Taylor finally turned to face her mother, tears pooling in her eyes. "I just don't understand why it had to be this way. Why did Stephen hate Mark so much? Why did he have to destroy our lives?" Linda shook her head, her expression weary. "Some people can't stand to see others happy. Stephen saw Mark's love for me as a threat to everything he thought he deserved, and he let that bitterness consume him." A bitter laugh escaped Taylor's lips. "And we were the collateral damage." Linda's eyes filled with guilt. "I know it's not fair, and I wish I could change it. But all we can do now is move forward, together." Taylor wiped at her cheeks and nodded, her voice barely steady. "Yeah, together." They got out of the car, the sun warming their faces as they walked toward the house. The screen door creaked as Linda pushed it open, the familiar scent of home greeting them. It was comforting and heartbreaking all at once. Taylor dropped her bag by the door and collapsed onto the couch, her body finally acknowledging the exhaustion that had been creeping up on her all day. Linda sat beside her, her presence a steady anchor. "Mark said he wants to be in my life," Taylor murmured, staring at the ceiling. "But I don't know if I'm ready for that." Linda's fingers brushed a strand of hair from Taylor's face. "It's okay to be scared. It's a big decision. But whatever you choose, It's your choice, no one else's. Taylor closed her eyes, letting the words sink in. The idea of having a father, of building a relationship with Mark, felt like trying to hold water in her hands. Impossible to grasp fully, but the thought of shutting him out, of denying the connection they shared, felt wrong too. I want to get to know him, Taylor admitted quietly. But I don't want to lose myself in the process. Linda smiled, her eyes filled with pride. You won't. You're strong, Taylor, stronger than you know, and Mark sees that. He wants to know you, not change you. A faint smile tugged at Taylor's lips. I guess we'll see. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of the day settling around them. The sound of a car pulling up outside broke the stillness. Taylor's eyes snapped open, her body tense. Who could that be? Linda asked, frowning. Taylor stood and peeked out the window. Her heart skipped a beat. It was Mark's car. He's here, she whispered. Half to herself, Linda squeezed her hand. You can do this. Taylor took a deep breath and opened the door. Mark stood on the porch, his hands in his pockets, his eyes filled with uncertainty. I hope I'm not intruding, he said softly. Taylor shook her head. No, come in. He stepped inside, his gaze taking in the modest home. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a quiet reverence. It's good to see you both, Linda smiled gently. It's good to see you too, Mark. He turned to Taylor, his expression tentative. I wanted to come by and let you know. I'm not going anywhere. I'll give you all the time you need. I just want to be part of your life. However, you'll let me. Taylor's chest tightened, the sincerity in his voice, the vulnerability he showed. It chipped away at her defenses. I want that too, she said quietly. But we'll take it slow. He nodded, relief flooding his features. Slow is fine. I've waited this long. I can wait a little longer. A fragile hope bloomed in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, they could start to heal. The past had taken so much, but the future was still theirs to shape. As they sat down together, the room felt a little warmer, a little brighter, and for the first time in a long time, Taylor felt like the pieces of her life were finally falling into place. The sunlight filtered through the thin curtains, casting warm patterns on the worn living room floor. Taylor glanced at Mark sitting across from her, his hands wrapped around the mug of coffee Linda had just handed him. The air was thick with uncertainty, but there was also an undercurrent of hope. Fragile yet persistent, Mark took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes scanning the room. It was clear he was taking everything in. The small, cozy home, the faded photographs on the mantel, the quiet dignity in its simplicity. He set the mug down and looked at Taylor, his gaze steady but cautious. I know it must be overwhelming, he said, his voice low and measured. I don't want to push you into anything. I just want to know you, to be here for you, in whatever way you're comfortable with. Taylor's fingers traced the rim of her own mug. The warmth seeped into her hands, grounding her. She took a deep breath, searching for the right words. I appreciate that, Mark. It's just, I've spent my whole life with things being one way. It's hard to imagine them changing. Linda settled into the chair beside Taylor, her eyes soft and encouraging. Change can be scary, she said gently, but sometimes it's exactly what we need. Taylor's chest tightened. She knew her mother was right. The past had held them captive for too long, shrouded in secrets and pain. Maybe opening a door to Mark wasn't just about finding a father. It was about reclaiming the life that had been stolen from them. She met Mark's eyes, the vulnerability in them mirroring her own. I want to try, she said, her voice steady. I want to get to know you, but I need time, and I need things to feel real, not forced. Mark nodded, a smile softening his features. That's all I could hope for. A quiet understanding settled between them, like a bridge being cautiously built. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that allowed space to breathe, to process, to heal. After a moment, Mark leaned back, his eyes drifting to the photos on the mantel. One picture in particular caught his attention. A younger Taylor, maybe 6 or 7, missing her front teeth and grinning wildly as she clutched a prize ribbon from the county fair. He smiled. You look just like your mother in that picture. Taylor glanced at it and laughed softly. That was the year I won the pie-eating contest. I was so proud of myself, Mark chuckled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. I can see that. Did you win a lot of contests? She shrugged. Not really. Not. But Mom always made me feel like I was the champion of everything. Linda smiled, tears glimmering in her eyes. You were my champion. You still are. The warmth in her mother's voice settled in Taylor's heart like a balm. For all the pain and struggle, they had always had each other. And maybe now, they could have more. Mark's expression grew serious. I want to help you, Taylor. Not just with getting to know me, but with anything you need. School, work, whatever dreams you have, I want to support them. Taylor shifted in her seat. I appreciate that, but I don't want money or charity. I've worked hard for everything I have, and I don't want to lose that. Mark nodded, respect shining in his eyes. I understand. It's not about charity. It's about giving you the opportunities you deserve, but only if you want them. She considered his words carefully. There was no condescension in his voice, no attempt to buy her affection, just a genuine desire to be part of her life. It felt strange, having someone offer that kind of support. I'll think about it, she said finally. Right now, I just want to take things one step at a time. That sounds good to me, Mark agreed, a genuine smile lifting his face. One step at a time. A knock at the door broke the moment. Taylor frowned, standing up to answer it. When she opened the door, her best friend Jenna stood there, her eyes wide with curiosity. Hey, Tay, Jenna said, glancing over her shoulder into the living room. Am I interrupting something? Taylor shook her head, forcing a smile. No, come in. Jenna stepped inside, her eyes darting to Mark, who stood and extended his hand. You must be Jenna. I'm Mark. Jenna shook his hand, her eyebrows raised. Mark is in... Taylor nodded, the weight of the revelation settling over her again. Yeah, my father. Jenna's eyes softened, and she squeezed Taylor's arm. Wow, that's a lot. Yeah, Taylor replied, a small smile tugging at her lips. But we're figuring it out. Jenna grinned. Good, because you deserve some good things, Tay. Mark smiled warmly. I couldn't agree more. The room filled with a sense of cautious hope, for the first time in a long time. Taylor felt like the future wasn't a maze of dead ends. It was a path, winding and uncertain, but full of possibility, and she was ready to take that first step. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the living room window, casting a golden glow over everything it touched. Jenna settled onto the armrest of the couch, her eyes flicking between Taylor and Mark, trying to piece together the puzzle of their situation. The quiet hum of the ceiling fan filled the silence, its rhythmic whir a reminder of the normalcy that felt just out of reach. So, Jenna started, her voice hesitant. This is a lot, huh? Taylor managed a small smile. Yeah, you could say that. Jenna looked at Mark, her expression softening. It's nice to meet you. Taylor's told me a lot about her mom, but, well, you're kind of a surprise. Mark chuckled lightly, his eyes crinkling at the edges. I've been a surprise to myself lately, but it's nice to meet you too. Taylor felt a strange comfort in seeing Jenna and Mark interact. It was like two parts of her life, previously separate, were starting to weave together. The threads of connection were fragile, but they were there. Jenna shifted, her gaze turning serious. Are you okay, Tay? Really? Taylor took a deep breath. The question, simple as it was, carried so much weight. Was she okay? She wasn't sure she knew the answer, but there was one thing she did know. She wasn't alone. I think I'm getting there, she said, her voice steady. It's a lot to process, but I want to give it a chance. Jenna nodded, a proud smile curving her lips. That sounds like you, always facing things head on. Mark's eyes shone with quiet admiration. Your friend knows you well. Taylor's cheeks warmed slightly. It felt strange to have someone like Mark notice things about her. Someone who had missed so many years. And yet, here he was, trying to catch up, trying to know her. Linda stood up, brushing her hands against her jeans. I'm going to get started on dinner. Taylor, why don't you and Mark go for a walk, get some fresh air? Taylor hesitated, glancing at Mark. He gave a small, encouraging nod. I'd like that. Jenna grinned. I'll stay and help your mom. Go. Taylor rolled her eyes playfully. You just want to eat before everyone else. Guilty, Jenna replied. Laughing, Taylor grabbed her worn denim jacket from the hook by the door and stepped outside, Mark following close behind. The air was cool and crisp, tinged with the scent of freshly cut grass. They walked side by side down the quiet street, the silence between them feeling less awkward now, more like a space where understanding could grow. The rhythmic crunch of their footsteps on the gravel seemed to echo the thoughts swirling in her mind. After a while, Mark spoke, his voice low and tentative. "This is a nice town," he said, glancing around. "Quiet, peaceful." Taylor nodded. "It's home. I used to dream of leaving, of going somewhere bigger. But there's comfort in what you know." He smiled, a touch of sadness in his eyes. "I wish I could have been here for you, to know this part of your world." Her chest tightened. "I wish that too, but we can't change the past." "No," he agreed softly, "but we can build something now." They reached the small park at the end of the street. The swings creaked in the breeze, and the old oak tree stood tall and sturdy, its branches stretching wide like open arms. Taylor had spent countless afternoons here as a child, her mom sitting on a bench nearby, always keeping watch. She walked over to the swings, her fingers curling around the cool metal chains. "I used to come here when things got tough. It helped clear my head." Mark watched her, his expression thoughtful. "I had a place like that too, when I was younger, a spot by the river where I'd go to think, to escape the pressure of everything." Taylor looked up at him, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes. "It's strange, isn't it? How we lived such different lives but still had the same need to escape." He nodded, his jaw tightening. "I guess some things are universal. No matter how much money you have, some feelings don't change." She let his words sink in, a wave of understanding passing between them. For so long, she had thought of Mark's world as something unreachable, a life so different from hers that they could never overlap. But maybe the divide wasn't as wide as she had imagined. "I want to know more about you," she said quietly. "Not just the parts connected to me and Mom, the real you." Mark's face softened, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I want that too. I want to share those things with you. And I want to hear about your life, your dreams, everything." She pushed the swing gently, the motion soothing. "It's going to take time." "I know," he replied. "But I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." The sincerity in his voice settled in her heart like a promise. She wasn't sure what their future held, but for the first time, it felt like a future worth exploring. They turned back toward home, the setting sun casting long shadows across the pavement. As they walked, Taylor felt a little lighter, the burden of the past loosening its grip. The threads of connection were still fragile, but they were real. And maybe, just maybe, they could weave something new together. The walk back home was quiet, but it wasn't the heavy silence that had hung between them earlier. This was a companionable silence, filled with the tentative beginnings of understanding. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting the street in shades of orange and purple. Crickets had begun their evening song, and the air grew cooler with the promise of night. Taylor slipped her hands into the pockets of her denim jacket, the gravel crunching beneath her boots. Mark walked beside her, his strides slow, unhurried, as if he were savoring every moment. It struck her how careful he was with his words, his actions, like he was afraid of breaking something fragile. When they reached the porch, Mark paused, his gaze lingering on the familiar structure of the house. He seemed to be memorizing every detail, the peeling paint on the wooden steps, the wind chimes swaying gently, the potted flowers Linda kept by the door. "This place feels like home," he said softly. "I can see how much love has been built here." Taylor nodded, her throat tight. "It's not much, but it's ours." Mark turned to her, his eyes earnest. "I'd like to be a part of that if you'll let me, not to change it, but to add to it." She looked away for a moment, emotions swirling inside her. The idea of Mark becoming a part of her life felt both comforting and overwhelming, but she knew he was trying, truly trying to bridge the gap between them, and maybe she wanted that too. "Let's take it slow," she said finally. "One step at a time," he smiled, relief softening his features. "That works for me." They stepped onto the porch together, the screen door creaking as Taylor pushed it open. The smell of garlic and herbs greeted them, the warmth of the house wrapping around her like a familiar embrace. Laughter filtered through from the kitchen. where Jenna and Linda were chatting as they stirred pots and set the table. "Smells amazing," Mark said, taking in the scene. Linda looked up, her face brightening. "We're almost ready. Hope you like spaghetti." Mark chuckled. "I love spaghetti." Taylor smiled. "You're in luck then? Mom's spaghetti is legendary." "Flattery will get you extra garlic bread," Linda teased, her eyes twinkling. They all settled around the small wooden table. The chairs scraped close to fit everyone. It was cramped, imperfect, but it felt right. Mark's presence didn't feel out of place. Instead, it felt like a missing puzzle piece finally snapping into place as they ate. The conversation flowed more easily than Taylor had expected. Jenna filled the gaps with her usual humor, recounting stories of their childhood, the times they'd gotten into harmless trouble or competed in school events. "Remember the talent show in 6th grade?" Jenna grinned, nudging Taylor with her elbow. "You sang that Taylor Swift song and forgot the second verse," Taylor groaned, hiding her face behind her hands. "Why do you always bring that up?" "Because it was hilarious," Jenna laughed. "You just hummed the rest of the song and smiled like you meant to do it." Mark chuckled, his eyes crinkling with amusement. "I'd love to see a video of that." "Don't even think about it," Taylor warned, her smile betraying her mock-serious tone. Linda laughed softly, her eyes shining. "She's always been brave, though, even when things didn't go as planned." Taylor's heart swelled at the compliment, and she met her mother's gaze with gratitude. The warmth of the moment, the laughter shared between friends and family, wrapped around her like a safety net she hadn't realized she needed. As the meal wound down, Mark leaned back in his chair, his expression content. "Thank you for this," he said. "For letting me be here." Linda nodded, her voice gentle. "Everyone deserves a second chance." Taylor felt the truth of those words sink deep into her bones. This was new territory, a path she hadn't planned on walking, but maybe second chances were worth exploring. After the dishes were cleared and the table wiped down, Mark stood up, stretching slightly. "I should get going. It's getting late." Taylor walked him to the door, the cool night air brushing against her skin. They stood there for a moment, the porch light casting soft shadows around them. "Thank you for coming tonight," she said, her voice quiet. "It meant a lot." "It meant a lot to me too," Mark replied. He hesitated, then added, "I'll call tomorrow if that's okay." She nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Yeah, that's okay." He gave her a nod and walked down the steps, his figure disappearing into the growing darkness. Taylor watched until his car's taillights vanished down the street, the quiet hum of the engine fading into the night. When she turned back, Linda was waiting in the doorway, her expression soft. "You okay?" her mother asked. Taylor took a deep breath and nodded. "Yeah, I think I am." Linda wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "We're going to be okay, sweetheart, no matter what." As they stepped inside, the door closing behind them with a familiar creak, Taylor felt a glimmer of hope settle in her chest. The bridge between the past and the future was being built, one careful step at a time, and for the first time in a long while, she felt steady on her feet. The next morning, Taylor woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside her window. The sunlight streamed through the thin curtains, painting patterns on her walls. She stretched, her muscles aching from the tension of the past few days. The weight of everything that had happened pressed against her chest. The truths uncovered, the connections forged. It was almost too much to process. She rolled out of bed and padded to the kitchen. Linda was already there, nursing a cup of coffee. The lines on her face seemed softer today, like a burden had been lifted. Taylor grabbed a mug and poured herself some coffee, the rich aroma comforting in its familiarity. "Morning, sweetheart," Linda said, her voice gentle. "Morning," Taylor murmured. Taking a sip, the warmth spread through her, but it couldn't dissolve the knots in her stomach. Linda watched her carefully. "Rough night," Taylor shrugged. "I guess I'm just trying to figure out how I feel about everything. About Mark. About us." Linda nodded, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. "It's okay to have doubts. This isn't something you have to figure out all at once." Taylor sighed. "I know, but it feels like there's a clock ticking. Like if I don't make the right move, I'll lose this chance." Linda's eyes softened. "Honey, Mark isn't going anywhere. He wants to be in your life, and he's willing to take things slow. You don't have to rush. Taylor nodded, but the doubts still gnawed at her. What if Mark changed his mind? What if this fragile connection they were building fell apart before it had a chance to solidify, before she could voice her worries? Her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at the screen. It was Mark. "Hey," she said, picking up the call. "Morning, Taylor." Mark's voice came through, steady and warm. "I was wondering if you'd like to meet me for lunch today. No pressure, just some time to talk." Taylor hesitated, glancing at her mom. Linda gave her an encouraging nod. "Yeah, I'd like that," Taylor replied. "Great. How about the diner in town, noon?" "Sounds good. See you then." She hung up, her heart beating a little faster. The diner was a neutral place, somewhere familiar. It felt safe. Yet, as she thought about sitting across from Mark, talking one-on-one, the anxiety returned. "You're going to be fine," Linda said, reading her daughter's mind. "Just be yourself. That's all he wants." Taylor managed a small smile. "I'll try." By the time she pulled into the diner's gravel parking lot, her nerves were jangling. She took a deep breath, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. The bright red "open" sign blinked in the window, as if beckoning her inside. "You can do this," she told herself. Stepping out of the car, she smoothed her shirt and walked toward the entrance. The familiar chime of the bell above the door greeted her, along with the smell of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee. The booths were filled with locals chatting over their meals, the hum of conversation grounding her. Mark was already there, sitting at a corner booth, his hands wrapped around a glass of water. He looked up as she approached, his face breaking into a warm smile. "Hey, Taylor," he said, standing up slightly as she slid into the seat across from him. "Hey," she replied, trying to match his smile. A waitress appeared, her notepad poised. "What can I get you two?" "I'll have a burger and fries," Taylor said, grateful for the simplicity of the choice. Mark smiled. "Same for me." Once the waitress left, an awkward silence settled between them. Taylor fiddled with the edge of her napkin, her thoughts tangling together. "You seem quiet today," Mark said gently. "Is everything okay?" She took a deep breath, deciding honesty was the best option. "I guess I'm just scared, this whole thing. Finding out about you, about what happened with Mom. It's like everything I knew about my life has shifted." Mark nodded, his expression somber. "I get that, and I don't want to add more confusion. I just want to be here for you." Taylor met his eyes, seeing the sincerity in them. "But what if it doesn't work out? What if we try to build something and it falls apart?" Mark leaned forward, his hands resting on the table. "That's a risk, Taylor, but it's a risk I'm willing to take because I've already lost too much time with you. I don't want to lose any more." Her heart clenched. The vulnerability in his voice made her own walls tremble. He wasn't just asking for a chance. He was offering a part of himself, one that had been hidden for years. The waitress returned with their plates, the clatter of dishes breaking the tension. Taylor stared at her burger, the steam rising from the patty, and took a small bite. The familiar taste settled her nerves. Mark picked at his fries, his eyes searching her face. "You don't have to have all the answers now. We can take this one day at a time." Taylor swallowed, the knots in her stomach loosening just a bit. "Okay, one day at a time." He smiled, and this time, it reached his eyes. "That's all I ask." They ate in comfortable silence, the noise of the diner around them like a protective cocoon. For the first time since everything had changed, Taylor felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could figure this out together. When they finished, Mark paid the bill, and they walked out into the warm afternoon sun. He paused by her car, his hands in his pockets. "Thanks for meeting me," he said softly. Taylor nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Thanks for asking." As she got into her car and drove away, the shadows of doubt still lingered, but they were quieter now, pushed back by the faint glow of possibility. Taylor drove home with the window down, letting the warm breeze sweep across her face. The rhythmic hum of the tires against the pavement matched the steady beat of her heart. The lunch with Mark had gone better than she expected, but her emotions were still a swirling mess of hope, fear, and uncertainty. As the familiar sights of her neighborhood came into view, a sense of grounding returned. The chipped paint on the mailbox, the overgrown grass along the driveway, The sunflowers her mother insisted on planting every spring, even when they barely had enough money for groceries, felt like anchors holding her to reality. She parked the truck and climbed out, the gravel crunching beneath her boots. Linda's face appeared at the kitchen window, a mixture of curiosity and concern in her eyes. Taylor smiled faintly and waved before heading inside. "Hey, sweetheart," Linda said, as Taylor stepped into the kitchen. The smell of fresh-baked bread filled the air, and the coziness of home wrapped around her like a warm blanket. "How did it go?" Taylor dropped her bag by the door and slumped into a chair at the kitchen table. "It was good, I think. Weird, but good." Linda sat down across from her, her eyes searching Taylor's face. "Weird how?" Taylor hesitated, trying to put her thoughts into words. "I guess I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop. Like, if I let myself trust this, if I let him into my life, something's going to come along and ruin it." Linda's eyes softened, a flicker of sadness passing through them. "I know that feeling, honey. It's hard to believe in good things when life's thrown so many curveballs." Taylor picked at a loose thread on the tablecloth. "Yeah, but he says he's willing to take things one day at a time. I want to try, I really do." Linda reached out, covering Taylor's hand with her own. "That's all you can do. Trust doesn't come all at once. It's built little by little." Taylor nodded, letting out a slow breath. "I just don't want to get hurt. Or hurt you." Linda smiled gently. "You're not going to hurt me, sweetheart. I want you to have this chance. You deserve it." The front door creaked open, and Jenna's voice rang out. "Hey, Tay, you home?" "In the kitchen," Taylor called back. Jenna appeared in the doorway, her bright eyes scanning the room. "Good, you're here. I brought ice cream. Emergency supplies for overthinking." Taylor laughed despite herself. "You know me too well." Jenna grinned, pulling a pint of chocolate ice cream out of the bag. "I figured you might need a distraction." She grabbed spoons from the drawer, and the three of them dug into the ice cream, the cold sweetness melting away some of the tension in Taylor's chest. "So, how was lunch with Mr. Millionaire Dad?" Jenna asked, her tone light but curious. Taylor shrugged. "It was okay. We talked. He wants to get to know me, and I said we could take it slow." Jenna nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds fair. You don't have to figure everything out right away." "Yeah," Taylor said, swirling her spoon through the melting ice cream. "But it's hard not to overthink it, you know." "Oh, I know," Jenna said, rolling her eyes. "That's why I brought ice cream. It's the official cure for spiraling thoughts." Linda chuckled, the sound warm and comforting. "You girls are good for each other." Jenna winked. "That's the plan." The conversation drifted into lighter topics, the latest town gossip, upcoming events, and memories of their school days. Taylor felt some of the weight lift from her shoulders, replaced by the simple joy of being surrounded by people who loved her. For the first time in days, laughter came easily. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Jenna stretched and stood up. "I should get going. Got to help my mom with dinner." Taylor walked her to the door, the evening air cooling the warmth on her cheeks. Jenna turned and gave her a quick hug. "You're doing great. Tay, I'm proud of you." "Thanks, Jen," Taylor whispered, hugging her back. "See you tomorrow." "Of course," Jenna said, flashing a grin before jogging down the steps. Taylor lingered on the porch, watching the sky turn shades of pink and gold. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. She took a deep breath, feeling a quiet resolve settle in her chest. Mark had said they'd take things one day at a time. Maybe that was the key. Not trying to predict the future, not letting fear of what might happen keep her from living in the moment. She stepped back inside, closing the door behind her. Linda was washing dishes, the sound of running water filling the quiet. "Mom," Taylor said softly. Linda turned, a gentle smile on her face. "Yes, sweetheart. I think I'm ready to see where this goes," Taylor said. "With Mark, I don't want to be afraid anymore." Linda dried her hands and pulled Taylor into a hug, her arms warm and strong. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. "No matter what happens, we'll face it together." Taylor closed her eyes, letting the comfort of her mother's embrace wash over her. The shadows of doubt were still there, but they were quieter now, fading in the face of courage. Maybe the path ahead was uncertain, but it was hers to walk, and she was ready. The next morning, Taylor woke up with a strange sense of calm. The knots in her stomach, though still there, felt looser somehow. She stretched and let the sunlight filter across her face. Today felt like a small turning point, though she wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the decision she'd made the night before, to stop letting fear control her, to take this chance with Mark and see where it led. She threw on a pair of jeans and her favorite flannel shirt, the fabric soft and familiar. As she stepped into the kitchen, the smell of coffee greeted her, and Linda was already at the table. Reading the local paper, she looked up and smiled warmly. "Good morning, sweetheart." "Morning, Mom," Taylor replied, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "You're up early," Linda chuckled. "Old habits die hard. Besides, I like having a quiet moment before the day gets going." Taylor took a seat across from her, savoring the warmth of the mug in her hands. "I'm meeting Mark again today," she said, her voice steady. "He asked if I'd like to see his place." Linda's eyes softened, a mix of pride and understanding in them. "That's a big step." Taylor nodded. "Yeah, it is, but I want to know more about him, about his life." "I think that's brave," Linda said, reaching across the table to squeeze Taylor's hand. "You're opening a door that's been closed for a long time. It's okay to be nervous." Taylor took a deep breath and smiled. "I am nervous, but I think I'm ready." A few hours later, Taylor pulled up to the wrought iron gates of Mark's estate. The gates creaked open slowly, and she drove down the long, winding driveway. The towering trees on either side of the path seemed to bow overhead, creating a tunnel of dappled light. Her heart thudded with each turn of the wheels. The mansion came into view, its grandeur still overwhelming. The stone facade, the tall windows that gleamed in the sunlight. It felt like stepping into a different world. But Taylor reminded herself that, behind all the wealth, Mark was just a man trying to reconnect with his daughter. Mark was waiting on the steps, his hands in his pockets, his expression open and hopeful. He gave her a small wave as she parked and climbed out of the truck. "Hey," he said softly, his smile tentative. "Hey," Taylor replied, returning the smile. "Thanks for coming," he said, his voice sincere. "I know this must feel strange." "A little," she admitted, glancing up at the house. "But I want to be here." He nodded, relief flashing across his face. "Come on in. I'd love to show you around." They stepped through the grand entrance, the cool marble floors and high ceilings making her feel momentarily out of place. But Mark's presence grounded her. He walked beside her, pointing out different rooms. The sitting room with the grand piano, the dining hall with its long mahogany table, the sunroom that overlooked the sprawling gardens. "This place feels too big sometimes," Mark said as they walked through a hallway lined with old family portraits. "I used to think having all this meant something, but it doesn't mean much when you're alone." Taylor looked at the paintings, stoic faces, eyes that seemed to watch her. "It's hard to imagine living here and feeling lonely." Mark's gaze turned distant. "I spent a lot of years filling my life with work. I thought success would make up for the emptiness, but I was wrong." They reached the library and Mark pushed open the heavy wooden doors. Sunlight poured in through the tall windows, illuminating shelves lined with books that stretched from floor to ceiling. The scent of leather and old paper filled the air. Taylor's eyes were drawn to the same photo she'd seen before, the picture of her mother holding her as a baby. It was framed on a small table beside an armchair. Mark followed her gaze. "I kept that picture close all these years. It was my reminder of what I lost, of what I hope to find again." Taylor swallowed the lump in her throat. "It's strange to think you had this all along, that you were looking for us while we were just living our lives." Mark's voice was low. "I regret every moment I missed. I wish I could go back and change things." She turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "We can't change the past, but maybe we can build something now." His smile was bittersweet. "I'd like that more than anything." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of years unspoken between them. Then Mark gestured toward the window, where a small path led through the gardens. "Want to go for a walk?" he asked. Taylor nodded, feeling the tension ease just a little. "Yeah, let's go." They stepped outside, the breeze carrying the scent of roses and fresh-cut grass. As they walked through the winding paths, Taylor felt the distance between them shrinking. Step by step, the mansion, the wealth, the years lost, all of it faded into the background. What mattered was this moment, the chance to know her father, the chance to let him know her, and for the first time, she felt like maybe they could find their way through the unknown, together. The garden path wound beneath a canopy of trees, sunlight filtering through the leaves, casting shifting patterns on the gravel beneath their feet. The scent of roses mingled with the sharp freshness of pine, grounding Taylor in the moment. Mark walked beside her, his steps slow and unhurried, as if he were afraid to rush what was unfolding between them. They hadn't spoken much since they left the library, but the silence wasn't heavy. It felt more like an unspoken understanding, a fragile bridge being built between two people who were still learning how to connect. As they rounded a bend, a small gazebo came into view. Vines of ivy climbed its posts, and white roses bloomed in clusters along the latticework. A wooden bench sat in the shade, beckoning them to pause. Mark gestured toward it. "Want to sit for a while?" Taylor nodded. "Yeah, that sounds nice." They settled onto the bench, the quiet hum of the breeze and distant birdsong filling the space between them. Taylor ran her fingers along the smooth grain of the bench, feeling the coolness of the wood beneath her touch. The peacefulness of the garden was a stark contrast to the turmoil that still lingered in her heart. Mark cleared his throat, his eyes fixed on a cluster of roses. "I used to come out here a lot, especially when things with the family got complicated." "Complicated how?" Taylor asked softly. He sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly. "My parents put a lot of pressure on me to live up to their expectations. I was supposed to take over the family business, to do everything just right. But when I met your mom, everything changed. Suddenly, I didn't care about any of it. I just wanted to be with her." Taylor's chest tightened. "And they couldn't accept that." Mark shook his head, a sad smile tugging at his lips. "No, they saw it as a threat to the family's reputation. And Stephen, well, he saw it as an opportunity to push me out of the picture." Taylor took a deep breath. "The pieces falling into place. So he made sure you and Mom were torn apart." "Yes," Mark said quietly. "I let myself believe the lies. I didn't fight hard enough to find the truth, and I've regretted it every day since." Taylor looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting together. "It feels like we all lost so much time because of other people's choices." Mark's eyes met hers, the pain in them mirrored in her own. "We did, and I know I can't give you back that time, but I want to be here now. For you, for your mom, if you'll let me." She swallowed the lump rising in her throat. The honesty in his words cut through the walls she'd built around her heart. He wasn't trying to erase the past or pretend everything was fine. He was just asking for a chance. "I want that too," she whispered. "I want to know you, but I need to feel like it's real, like we're building something solid." He nodded, his expression soft. "I understand. One step at a time, remember?" A small smile tugged at her lips. "Yeah, one step at a time." They sat quietly for a moment, the breeze rustling the leaves overhead. Taylor felt a sense of calm settle over her, like the ground beneath her feet was finally solidifying. The doubts were still there, but they felt smaller now, more manageable. Mark's voice broke the silence. "There's something I want to show you, if you're up for it." She glanced at him, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "What is it?" He stood and held out his hand. "Come with me." Taylor hesitated for just a moment before slipping her hand into his. His grip was warm and steady, a silent promise that he wasn't going anywhere. They walked deeper into the garden, the path narrowing as they passed through a shaded archway. Ahead of them, a clearing opened up. In the center stood a young oak tree, its branches stretching toward the sky. A small plaque rested at its base, the metal glinting in the sunlight. Taylor stepped closer, her eyes scanning the inscription. "For Linda and Taylor, roots that were lost, branches that will grow." Her breath caught in her throat. "You planted this." Mark nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "After I realized how much I'd lost, I planted this tree. I wanted something that would grow, that would last. A reminder that even though we were apart, there was still hope." Tears welled in Taylor's eyes. The gesture was simple, yet it held so much meaning. A symbol of what had been lost and what could still be built. She reached out, her fingers brushing the rough bark. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Mark's voice was barely audible. "I hoped one day you'd see it, that we could watch it grow together." Taylor turned to him, her heart aching with a mix of sadness and hope. "I think we can." A tear slid down Mark's cheek, and he let out a shaky breath. "Thank you, Taylor, for giving me a chance." She smiled through her own tears. "Thank you for not giving up." They stood side by side, the oak tree casting its shade over them. The roots of their past were tangled and broken, but new branches were forming, strong, resilient, and reaching toward the sky. And for the first time, Taylor believed they could grow together. The drive home was quiet, but the silence was comfortable, a gentle space where thoughts could settle and emotions could breathe. Taylor's fingers curled loosely around the steering wheel, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. The image of the young oak tree stayed with her, its branches reaching toward the sky, a symbol of possibility she hadn't known she needed. Mark's words echoed in her mind, roots that were lost, branches that will grow. As she pulled into the driveway, the house felt smaller than before, but no less comforting. The familiar creak of the front steps, the scent of home clinging to the air. It was a world she understood, even if her heart was expanding to hold more. Linda was waiting by the door, her eyes searching Taylor's face. The worry lines softened when she saw the quiet resolve in her daughter's expression. "Hey, sweetheart," Linda said, her voice gentle. "How did it go?" Taylor smiled, the corners of her mouth lifting just enough to show the glimmer of hope she felt. "It went better than I thought it would. He showed me a tree he planted for us. It felt real." Linda's eyes shone with unshed tears. "He's trying, isn't he?" "Yeah," Taylor replied softly. "He really is." Linda pulled her into a hug, the warmth of her embrace grounding Taylor. "I'm proud of you, honey. This isn't easy, but you're facing it with so much courage." Taylor swallowed the lump in her throat, clinging to her mother a little tighter. "I just want us to be okay. All of us. We will be," Linda whispered. "No matter what happens, we'll figure it out." They stayed like that for a moment, wrapped in each other's strength. When they finally pulled away, Linda brushed a strand of hair from Taylor's face. "How about some dinner? I made chicken pot pie." Taylor's stomach growled on cue, and she laughed. "That sounds perfect." They sat at the small kitchen table, the warmth of the food and the familiarity of home filling the spaces that words didn't need to. The comfort of routine wrapped around Taylor like a well-worn blanket. For all the uncertainty swirling in her life, this was her anchor. Halfway through dinner, a knock at the door broke the stillness. Taylor's fork paused midair, a twinge of anxiety curling in her stomach. "I'll get it," Linda said, standing up. Taylor took a deep breath and focused on her plate, trying to quiet the sudden rush of nerves. The sound of voices at the door made her glance up. Linda's tone was calm but guarded. "Stephen?" Linda said, her voice cool. "What are you doing here?" Taylor's stomach clenched. She set her fork down and stood up, moving toward the door. When she reached the entryway, she saw Stephen standing on the porch, his expression tight and unreadable. He looked different from the last time she'd seen him. The confidence, the arrogance. It was dimmed, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like regret. His eyes flicked to Taylor, his jaw tightening. "I need to talk to you," Stephen said, his voice low. "Both of you." Linda crossed her arms, her stance firm. "Why now, Stephen? After everything you've done?" He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Because I'm tired of carrying it, the lies, the guilt. It's all eating me alive." Taylor's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to slam the door in his face, to tell him that his guilt wasn't her problem. But she also wanted answers. Closure. Linda glanced at Taylor, her eyes questioning. Taylor took a shaky breath and nodded. "Let him in." Stephen stepped inside, the weight of his presence pressing against the walls of the small house. He looked around, his eyes landing on the photos, the signs of a life that had gone on without him. They all sat in the living room, the tension like a live wire between them. Stephen rubbed his hands together, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I know I can't undo what I did," he started, his voice rough. "I thought I was protecting the family, but all I did was tear it apart, and now I'm paying for it." Linda's jaw clenched. "You destroyed lives, Stephen. Do you really expect us to forgive you?" Stephen shook his head, his eyes glistening. "No, I don't deserve forgiveness, but I needed to say I'm sorry, to admit what I did. I don't want to carry this anymore." Taylor's heart twisted. She didn't know if his remorse was genuine or if it was just another manipulation, but the rawness in his voice felt real. "You stole time from us," Taylor said, her voice trembling. "Years we can't get back." Stephen's face crumpled, his shoulders sagging. "I know, and I'll never forgive myself for that." The room was silent, the weight of his confession settling into every corner. Taylor took a deep breath, trying to untangle the knot of anger and sadness in her chest. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said honestly, "but I don't want to carry this anger forever. I'm tired of it." Linda's hand squeezed Taylor's, her eyes filled with strength. "We'll decide what to do with your apology, Stephen. But whatever happens, you don't get to control our lives anymore." Stephen nodded. Standing up, his face was lined with defeat. "That's fair." He walked to the door, pausing just before he left. "I hope you can find some peace." The door closed behind him, the quiet that followed heavy but somehow cleaner. Taylor let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Linda turned to her, her eyes soft. "We don't have to forgive him, Taylor. Not now, maybe not ever. But we can let go of the hold he had on us." Taylor nodded, a sense of release washing over her. "Yeah, I think we can." And for the first time, she felt like the past wasn't a weight she had to carry anymore. It was a part of her story, but it didn't have to define her future. The door clicked shut behind Stephen, and the silence that followed felt almost sacred. Taylor let out a long, shaky breath, the weight of years of pain loosening its grip. The living room, small and familiar, seemed lighter somehow, as though an unseen burden had finally been lifted. Linda's hand remained clasped in hers, a steady reminder that no matter what storms they faced, they were still standing. They were still here, together. "Are you okay?" Linda asked, her voice gentle but tinged with concern. Taylor nodded slowly. "I think so. It feels weird, though. Like I should feel more anger. But all I feel is relief." "That's not weird," Linda said softly. "Sometimes letting go of anger is the biggest relief of all." Taylor leaned into her mother's embrace, the warmth of it seeping into her bones. "I didn't think this day would ever come." Facing him, hearing him say he was sorry, Linda sighed, her fingers brushing Taylor's hair. "I didn't either, but we don't have to let his choices shape our lives anymore. We get to decide where we go from here." Taylor pulled back, meeting her mother's eyes. "Yeah, we do." A knock at the door made them both jump. Taylor's heart skipped a beat, a flicker of fear igniting before she pushed it down. It couldn't be Stephen again. This knock was lighter, more hesitant. Linda gave her an encouraging nod. "Go ahead, sweetheart." Taylor walked to the door and opened it. Mark stood there, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, his eyes full of cautious hope. "Hey," he said softly. "Is this a bad time?" Taylor shook her head, a small smile breaking through the tension on her face. "No, it's actually a perfect time." Mark's shoulders relaxed slightly, and he stepped inside. His eyes flicked toward Linda, his expression warm but respectful. "Hi, Linda." "Hi, Mark," she replied, her voice kind. "Come on in." He hesitated for just a moment, then crossed the threshold, as if the very act was a step into a new world. The three of them sat in the living room, the silence stretching out, not uncomfortable, but full of possibilities. Mark glanced at Taylor, his eyes full of questions he didn't know how to ask. "I ran into Stephen outside," he said quietly. "He didn't say much, but I could tell something happened." Taylor nodded. "Yeah, he came to apologize for everything." Mark's jaw tightened, a shadow of pain crossing his face. "Did it help?" "I think so," Taylor said honestly. "It didn't fix anything, but it made it easier to let go." Mark let out a slow breath, his eyes softening. "I'm glad. You both deserve to be free of that weight." Linda smiled gently. "We're getting there, one step at a time." Taylor's heart warmed at the phrase. It had become a sort of mantra, a promise they were all making to each other. No rush, no expectations, just the willingness to try. Mark leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees. "I've been thinking about how we move forward, about what that looks like." Taylor's stomach fluttered with nerves, but she nodded. "Me too. I know I can't make up for the years we lost," he said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "But I want to be part of your life, in whatever way you'll let me. I want to know your world, Your friends, your dreams, the little things that make you you. A lump formed in Taylor's throat, the vulnerability in his words, the quiet sincerity. It chipped away at the last walls she had been holding up. He wasn't trying to fix things with grand gestures or empty promises. He was offering something real, something honest. "I want that too," she whispered, "but it has to be real. It has to be built on trust." Mark nodded, his eyes glistening. "I promise, Taylor. No more secrets. No more lies." Linda reached out, her hand resting on Mark's arm. "I think we all want the same thing. To heal. To build something better." A tear slipped down Mark's cheek, and he smiled through it. "Thank you for giving me this chance." Taylor felt a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying lift off her shoulders. The path ahead was still uncertain, but it felt less daunting now, because they weren't walking it alone. "Let's start small," she said, a hint of a smile on her lips. "Maybe you can come to dinner this weekend, meet Jenna, see a bit of my world." Mark's face lit up, a genuine smile breaking through. "I'd love that," Linda grinned. "Better bring your appetite. Jenna eats enough for 3 people. Taylor laughed, the sound breaking the last bit of tension in the room. It felt good to laugh, to let hope bloom even in the face of uncertainty. They sat together, the sun casting warm light through the window, filling the room with a golden glow. The scars of the past were still there, but they no longer defined them. They were moving forward, step by step, hand in hand. For the first time in a long time, Taylor felt like the world was full of possibilities. The roots of their pain were deep, but the branches of their future were strong and reaching for the sky. And she was ready to see just how far they could grow. The week flew by faster than Taylor expected. Each day was filled with tentative steps forward. Text messages exchanged with Mark, brief phone calls that grew less awkward, and quiet conversations with Linda that soothed the lingering doubts in her heart. Bit by bit, the past's weight was giving way to something lighter, something hopeful. When Saturday finally arrived, Taylor found herself pacing the kitchen, her nerves humming with anticipation. The table was set, the aroma of roasted chicken and garlic bread filling the small house. Jenna had insisted on helping, and now she stood by the counter, munching on a carrot stick and watching Taylor with amused eyes. "You're going to wear a groove in the floor," Jenna teased. Taylor shot her a look, half exasperation, half gratitude. "I can't help it. It's a big deal." "I know," Jenna said, her voice softening. "But you're going to be fine. He's going to love this." Taylor sighed, leaning against the counter. "I just want tonight to feel normal, like we're a family, even if we're still figuring out what that means." Jenna nodded. "It doesn't have to be perfect, just honest." The doorbell rang, and Taylor's heart jumped. Linda wiped her hands on a dish towel, a reassuring smile on her face. "I'll get it." Taylor took a deep breath as her mom opened the door. Mark stood there, a bouquet of wildflowers in his hand, his expression a mix of hope and nervousness. "Hi, Linda," he said warmly, his eyes kind. "Hi, Mark," Linda replied, stepping back to let him in. "Come on in. You didn't have to bring flowers." Mark smiled, his gaze flicking to Taylor. "I wanted to." He held the bouquet out to her, the colorful petals bright against his hands. "I wasn't sure what to bring, but these felt right." Taylor took the flowers, a smile breaking through her nervousness. "They're perfect, thank you." Jenna gave a little wave from the counter. "Hey, Mark. I'm Jenna, the best friend and chief ice cream supplier." Mark chuckled. "It's good to finally meet you, Jenna. I've heard a lot about you. All good things, I hope." "Of course," Mark said, his eyes twinkling as everyone settled around the table. The initial awkwardness melted away. The clink of dishes, the warmth of laughter, the flow of easy conversation. It was almost surreal how natural it felt. Mark listened intently as Jenna and Taylor recounted stories from high school, his laughter genuine, his eyes shining with pride. Linda chimed in with memories of Taylor's childhood, moments Mark had missed, but was now piecing together like a patchwork quilt. He soaked up every detail, as though each story was a treasure being handed to him. At one point, Mark's gaze lingered on a photo hanging above the mantel. It was a picture of Taylor and Linda, both smiling broadly at the camera, arms wrapped around each other. A look of quiet regret crossed his face, but he quickly replaced it with a soft smile. "You two have built something beautiful together," he said, his voice filled with admiration. Linda nodded, her eyes gentle. We did, but there's always room for more. Taylor's heart squeezed at her mother's words. It was true. Their lives, once defined by struggle and loss, were now expanding to include hope and connection. After dinner, they moved to the living room. The air filled with the comforting scent of coffee and dessert. Taylor sank into the couch, feeling a warmth in her chest. She hadn't known she'd been missing. Mark sat beside her, his presence no longer foreign, but welcome. I know we're still figuring things out, Mark said, his voice low. But tonight, this means everything to me. Taylor met his eyes, the vulnerability in them mirrored in her own. To me too, I never thought I'd get this chance. Mark smiled, his eyes glistening. Neither did I, but I'm glad we did. Jenna stood up, stretching dramatically. Okay, this has been amazing, but if I don't leave now, I'm going to fall asleep on your couch. Taylor laughed. Thanks for helping, Jen. Jenna winked. Anytime, see you tomorrow. Yeah, definitely. As Jenna left, the house grew quieter, the night settling in around them. Mark shifted, his eyes thoughtful. I know it's not going to be perfect. I'll probably mess up, say the wrong thing sometimes. But I'm here, Taylor. I'm here for the long haul. Taylor reached for his hand, her fingers wrapping around his. We'll figure it out, one step at a time. A tear slipped down Mark's cheek, but he smiled, his grip firm and warm. One step at a time. Linda watched them, her eyes filled with a quiet peace. The wounds of the past hadn't vanished, but they were healing. The broken pieces of their lives were coming together, forming something new, something stronger. As they sat together, the weight of old pain gave way to the lightness of hope. The road ahead was long, and there would be challenges, but they weren't alone anymore. For Taylor, that was enough, more than enough. And as the stars blinked to life outside the window, she felt ready for whatever came next.